an area of old peat workings. And for a long time, throughout the 90s, this is largely where the two populations were. There were a couple of pairs in the north, and most of the pairs in Norfolk. And then they spread slightly west to reed bed sites, which have been created, brand new created wetlands from old carrot fields, arable land. And they've now moved further west to wet grassland sites in Cambridgeshire. And in the last couple of years, we've also had new birds turn up. We don't think these are connected to the East Anglian population. Birds turning up right in the northeast of Scotland and breeding on upland bogs, mires, wet areas. And there have been successful pairs breeding there now for a couple of years, and possibly longer. They were in very, very quiet, remote areas. There's also been regular pairs looking like they might breed, but never quite breeding, further north in Yorkshire, and also in Shropshire, on the northwest, just on the border with Wales. So our reintroduction project wanted to get these birds back into a new habitat, and also to, here everyone understands the power of this bird to ignite people's imagination, and we wanted to do that in the southwest to help protect our wetland areas as well as getting the birds back. We've now got birds breeding through this project, nesting in Somerset, where the reintroduction happened, and also in Gloucestershire, the next county north. So why the southwest of England? Why Somerset, this area called the Levels and Moors? There's some big, extensive, open, flat, wet lands that flood in the winter. There's good control of water levels, so we can create wetland areas. There's a lot of this area is managed for migrant birds in the winter. We get a quarter of the whole European population of teal go to southwest England. We often have 40 to 50,000 widgeon, Anas penelope, in the winter. It's a great area for wintering lapwing, Vanellus vanellus, 50,000 or more. So there's a very important wintering site on our sort of northwest, very mild corner of Europe. These wetlands will also provide potentially good breeding sites for the cranes. On the Levels and Moors, there's also a lot of very species-rich hay meadow. This is a habitat that's fairly rare in the UK, very rare in the UK, but in the southwest of England, there's thousands of hectares, low thousands, maybe a couple of thousand hectares, hopefully help crane conservation with some of the much rarer species across the world. So the chicks were reared, to cut a very long story short, transported to Somerset, ringed using the ELSA colourings, and released. And we carried on working with the cranes post-release in our costumes. This is to help reinforce behaviours, the cranes to be wary of people, to be wary of animals, dogs, foxes. And in the first year, particularly the first year of release, this was very, very important. In subsequent years, the young cranes very quickly attached themselves to the older brood, and they learned from the older birds. So 79 chicks that were released were fitted also with radio tags, standard, fairly cheap radio tags that helped us to locate the birds on a regular basis. We also used the North Star PTT satellite tags on some birds, we had no idea when we released the birds where they were going to go. They could have flown to the continent, they could have flown back to Brandenburg. We wanted to be sure that we had at least some with some good, reliable remote sensing tags. We've also, in the last 2 years, we've used GSM, GPS GSM leg-mounted tags made by a company called Ecotone. We have a couple of these working really well. There's a slightly long story there. But if you want to talk, do come and talk to us about the monitoring of these birds afterwards as well. And we also went to join Gunther and his team with the international team with the catching of cranes 1 June in 2010 to learn about fitting backpacks. And we in total fitted 27 birds with GPS backpacks made by EOS. And all this data has enabled us, along with a large team of local volunteers, to track the birds' movements. And this is a little map. You can see the scale at the top. The blue dots in the shape at the bottom left are around the area where the cranes were released. And for the first two...
recent part of this line, it is our group's research. Before that,
was to heaven. And when I say, oh, where is Su Lo, the Vietnamese don't know what I'm talking about. The literal translation is tall bird with red head. But if I ask them, where is Hak? Hak is the crane in the pagoda. And that is what they relate to. And they can tell me all about the bird. They say, oh, it feeds over there, it sleeps there, but if people disturb it, it will go to another place. So they know the bird. They do not know the technical Vietnamese word for the bird, but they know Hak. And you are, in many of your presentations, I hear these ideas as well. But it's these ecosystems that really link the birds. This is from the Platte River. And these are birds that have slept at night and they're lifting off in the morning. And when Ann Lacey was standing next to me when we watched this, and she said, how many birds are there? And I said, oh, wait 1 moment. 1, 2, 3. But actually I said, oh, maybe in the sky there are all of the birds, the same number of birds that breed in Wisconsin are in the sky above us right now. So maybe there are 30,000 birds. So I want to talk about a population, not the whole species of cranes, but a population of sandhill cranes that we have been studying for 3 decades. We have the good fortune to be able to mark our birds, and we mark whole social groups. So typically we have the adult male, the adult female, and we mark the chicks so that we know a lot about these birds. And so the information I want to share with you is about these birds. And since many of you are very good at banding, we Americans say banding, as you are ringing these birds, there are some differences that we have. One is that we use, of course, the color markers, which are very efficient to see birds quickly and at a long distance. But this basically is our country code. So different people in different geographic regions go out and they have a route that they drive along a road, and they stop every 2 kilometers and they listen for birds. And they record the species and the number of birds they hear calling. And these breeding bird surveys, there's one survey that is done at each of these X's, and they are done throughout the North American continent, mostly east of the Mississippi River, which is pretty much running like this. So on these counts, which were started in 1965, and so for the first decade, this is 11 years, but for the first decade, the number of cranes that were counted on the breeding bird surveys were here in Wisconsin, and this is in the state of Michigan, connected here. And the geographic mean center of these counts, which location of the birds and the numbers of the birds was here in the northeastern part of Wisconsin. So in that very first period of time of counting, the birds were focused in Wisconsin for the breeding period. In the next 11-year period, we can see that there are more sites that have cranes, and some of these circles are a little larger, so they have more birds, but the geographic mean center of all of these birds are still the same. Down here, from 1990 to 2001, Wisconsin is very much filling up with cranes, and we have birds in another part of the state of Michigan. They're expanding into Ontario, the country of Canada, in these locations in the state of Minnesota here. For those of our people, the large delegation here from Sweden, this is where many of your relatives are, in Minnesota. And then in the final decade where we are working here in 2002 to 2013, you can see the population is expanding very substantially as these overall numbers have increased. For the winter distribution, we used another way of counting birds, which we call the Christmas bird count. And the Christmas bird count is where volunteers go out around the holiday season of Christmas and New Year's, and they count all of the birds that they can find in a geographic area. And again, there are many, many counts that are done. All of the X's are Christmas bird counts that are done. And so in that time period, we can map the distribution of cranes during the winter time. Now I want to emphasize that during the winter time, this is at the end of December, and we know that many of our cranes migrate after that period. So this overestimates how far north birds winter. But in the first time period, which is the same time periods that you saw with breeding cranes, most of our birds in the first time period were wintering in Florida, with the geographic mean center around Gainesville, Florida. In the next period, more birds are in Florida, but they are starting to occur in the upper regions of South Africa because farmers were angry about the damage that they were causing to their fields, and they did not receive help, and so they poisoned them in very large numbers. But this does not have to do with just a place that is distant from us like Africa, or South Africa. In Wisconsin, even now, in 2012, 398 cranes were killed by farmers who were given permission by the federal government to kill those birds because they were angry about crop damage. And in this case, the federal government is not actually following their own rules, because the rules say that a farmer has to demonstrate that they have tried to solve crop damage with non-lethal methods first, and second, show that it does not work, and then third, have permission to shoot the birds. But the federal government, that's too much work, and so they just give the permission to shoot the birds. So we are still struggling with this in the United States. Our thinking about this is that if we are to be successful at a very large scale in space, over a broad area, and a large scale economically, we need to have a system that will work in our marketplace, because we don't think there's any other way for government to pay for it, or for NGOs to pay for it, or anything like that. And so this issue of scale is very important for us. And there are some challenges we have not solved yet. In the U.S., like we heard in Sweden, the damage to potatoes is very serious and it's very expensive. And we do not have a way to solve that problem yet, because potatoes are very different. Potatoes are a crop that grows in the ground over a period of time. It is not a kernel of seed that we put into the ground that is vulnerable for a short period. Now, does a population need to be controlled? We give you data from marked pairs of birds on territories over a long period of time. We have 60 to 65 territories that we monitor in our study area. That is about 8,500 hectares in size. This is a little bit different study area than what I showed you in dealing with crop damage. It's just because we have territories marked over a larger period than what we studied for crop damage. But basically, we have about 70 marked pairs of nesting birds. That might be 80 or 90 nesting pairs in 85 square kilometers, if I calculate that correctly. And so our density, compared to Mecklenburg, for example, is quite a bit higher. And this gives you maybe an idea of what you might have as a maximum in Mecklenburg if Eurasian cranes respond in a similar way that sandhill cranes do in North America. And our data for these breeding birds are based on resightings of the birds, and we have not so many compared to the great database that you have, but for a breeding population, it's a large number of resightings of birds. And what we found is that this is the production, the productivity of all of those marked territories of 60 to 65 birds here. This is year here, and this is the number of marked territories here. So we started marking these birds effectively in 1993, and so of course the number of marked territories that we have has increased during that time. But from about 2003 till now, so for the last decade, we have had somewhere between 55 and 65 marked territories that we have been constantly monitoring how successful these birds are. And what we found in the productivity is that our success was very high early and very low late. So that basically this intercept is somewhere around 0.12 cranes per territory. Now, if I remember correctly from the Mecklenburg study, your lowest estimates, I think, were 0.4 cranes per territory. Now, there's some differences in our data versus those from Germany. Our data are sledge-to migration. So, and if your data, which our migration is normally November, if your data are sledge-to or just to fledging, that is maybe August? Yes. And so you have our mortality or our survivorship data reflect 2 more years of exposure to, or 2 more months of exposure to predators, and so our productivity will be a little bit lower. But also, these are from actual territories. It is not just, these are marked territories, so it's static as far as the area that we're covering. But the regression, of course, is very significant. We also have in other populations, this is a population from the Rocky Mountains in the western part of the United States, and they have a very similar trend of declining productivity, and actually their regression is about the same. And their range, I know you use the numbers of percent young in the population. Our range, if we assume 50% of the population is non-territorial, not breeding, we have, our highest has been 20% young, and our lowest is 4.25% young in the population, just to compare to the measures that you make. And in this study, it was 12% to 3.4% was the lowest. So populations do appear to, in very dense areas, start to become regulated. What these data also tell us is this is a marked family. This is the adult female and the adult male, and there are 2 chicks here, all with very nice colorful bands. But what we find is that when a mate switch occurs in the population, the productivity goes down for about 3 years after a mate switch occurs. When you are hunting a population, these data suggest that if you remove birds from a population, you are effectively doing a mate switch. You are removing one of the adult members of that pair, and a new member will quickly fill that opening that occurs in the next breeding season, but it is essentially a mate switch, which means that one effect that hunting might have on these birds is actually to further reduce the productivity in the population. Other data that we have is from, this is our study area here, and these are the winter data that I showed you, but just more colorful. All the red dots are places where our birds have been resighted. What I find interesting is that from one breeding location in Wisconsin, our birds in winter cover the entire winter area. Very similar to what the Eurasian crane is beginning to do now here as well. From a question examining hunting, that's important because it means that if you hunt in the winter areas, you have a low probability of overhunting birds from one particular breeding area compared to another. So it's important data. But also, if you come back to the breeding population, what we find, what this recognizes is that 2/3 of the breeding population, as estimated by the breeding survey, occurs in Wisconsin. If Wisconsin allows hunting, and because the birds migrate late, we could very easily overharvest our local breeding birds. And so where you hunt the birds is very important. If you are too close to your breeding area, you might have a much greater chance of overharvesting your birds. So, how do we want to use the resource? We use the resource, in some places in North America, cranes are hunted. We also use the resource for tourism, especially in the eastern population, and that is becoming a much bigger producer of income. And of course, we heard from Hornborga that you had 150,000 visitors in 3 weeks?
Yeah, roughly.
Yeah, so that's a fair amount of kroner distributed in those visitations, I would guess. Have you estimated the amount of money?
Yes, it has been done, but I don't have that in my mind.
So an estimate occurs, but we just don't know it. I'm just repeating your answers so people can hear. Okay. Hooter, can you go up? But also, another resource is that as this population becomes more dense, birds expand. These are breeding locations of birds in the northeastern part of North America, in Quebec, in Canada, and in the George, in Nova Scotia, Georgia's home province, in New Brunswick, but also in the northeastern part of the United States. So as our population expands, these birds are expanding out, much like what we saw for England and in the Czech Republic. As the number of Eurasian cranes become more dense, the birds are expanding out. So what we do with the core part of the population, hunting or not, has an effect on the other places where cranes will go. And so states like Massachusetts, who have just a few cranes, they should have a say in whether or not they think hunting is a good idea or not. So finally, what we have tried very hard to do in North America is to avoid a big conflict about hunting, especially between the groups that want to hunt and groups that do not want to hunt. Because those very same groups, as Johan talked about on the first day, they also need to work together to protect wetlands. If we fail, if we have controversy that is too polarized, suddenly we have groups that want wetlands and don't want wetlands, and we fight where we should not fight. And this is very important, and it affects our weeping crane reintroduction because it affects the habitat that they use, and sometimes we want to work with hunting groups because we want to communicate with people to reduce the shooting of these birds that occur, not through hunting, but through vandalism. So, the conclusions that we have is that we think that crop damage, we have worked very hard to remove crop damage from the issue of hunting because it complicates things, and we think that there are other solutions, at least in North America. We also believe the populations will regulate themselves, but the real question is at what level? And that is an open question that society needs to engage in. And finally, how we want to use cranes is a very important question that many different groups need to be involved in. And for me, what I hear, what we heard yesterday morning in the agriculture damage discussion, these are our greatest challenges. And if you think about how fast the population in Europe or the population in North America, or in the eastern population is growing in North America, in 10 years, these populations could easily double at the current rate of growth. We do not have much time to engage in the real important issues of can we really solve crop damage effectively, and what do we think about this issue of hunting? So I'm very happy that the Agriculture Working Group is reforming, and I would challenge us, because I'm happy to be a part if you want me. I challenge us not just to think about this as individual countries and what we do in our own country, but what we can do as a whole. Because I think unless we work very efficiently, we will not succeed quickly enough. And the cost of that is with conflict, our options become much fewer. Yeah? when people are angry and fighting with each other, you do not have much ability to try new ideas. You have to react, and the government wants a solution. They don't want a solution in 10 years. They want a solution next year. So we need to prepare for the questions that our governments will ask us. And my idea in North America, and I think maybe appropriate for Europe, is how do we prepare for these simple questions of how do we solve this damage to crops throughout Europe? How do we solve, or how do we address these issues of hunting or other uses of the population in the short period of time that we will likely have? And that, I think, means writing big grants to work together. But what I'm most impressed with in my participation with you is how organized you are.